morning and welcome. I'm Jane Harmon, the Wilson Center's president and CEO. Thank you for joining us for this important forum to examine the U.S. Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM's, role in countering transnational organized crime and improving citizen security in Central America. Citizen insecurity poses an ongoing and rising challenge throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Latin America's crime rates are astonishing by any standard. The region's homicide rate is the highest in the world, creating a crisis that continually traps governments between the need for comprehensive reform and the public demand for immediate action, usually meaning the kind of police tactics harking back to the repressive pre-1980s dictatorships. Not a good response. The Center's Latin America program fosters comparative research and dialogue among scholars and policymakers from throughout the Americas in order to address citizen insecurity. The program also focuses special attention on the changing sub-regional dynamics of organized crime, and it recently released two superb publications. First, Organized Crime in Central America, the Northern Triangle, and second, The Rebellion of Criminal Networks, Organized Crime in Latin America and the Dynamics of Change. As a member of Congress for 105 years, that's what it felt like. It was actually only 9 terms. I visited Latin America on numerous occasions, especially to assess the terror threat, but I have seen the disastrous effects of crime and narco-terrorism on countries like Colombia, a place where our guest, I think, spent some of his school years in Bogota. Am I right? Yes, progress has been made, but there is still a long way to go. As one who served on all the congressional security committees, I can tell you that beyond Latin America and the Caribbean, organized crime is a global threat, and some of the money from organized crime, unfortunately, funds terror movements, which are alive and well around the world. Segue to the introduction of General Douglas Fraser. As a 4-star general and commander of SOUTHCOM, he manages a force of over 1,200 military and civilian personnel. The general has enjoyed a distinguished career in the Air Force, logging more than 2,800 flying hours in F-15 and F-16s, and received a multitude of decorations, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, Defense Superior Service Medal, and the Legion of Merit. And, given his current assignment, it seems fortunate and farsighted that, as I mentioned, he attended school, 3 years of high school in Bogota. Notwithstanding a proposed $13 million cut in their budget and seemingly insurmountable odds, General Fraser and his command are hard at work countering the effects of the illicit drug trade, maritime traffic, and organized crime throughout Central and South America. We just had a brief discussion in my office, and I was impressed by his view, which you'll hear in a moment, that military force alone is not the right way to go here, that it is what I call and what Joe Nye coined as the use of smart power, which is a far better strategy, not just by us, but by the governments in the region against this enormously toxic and difficult-to-defeat threat. So, General Fraser, we are honored by your presence and look forward to your remarks in the discussion that will follow. And I'm not sure whether I'm turning the podium over to Cindy or to General Fraser. What am I doing?
To General Fraser.
But let me just say about Dr. Cynthia Arnson, who directs our Latin America program, that, as I often say, if you want to get the job done right, put a woman in charge. And she is superb, and the program is one of our best here at the Wilson Center, among many other excellent programs. But it's a pleasure to have General Fraser here and to discuss a very hard topic, and I hope to brag a little bit about the excellent research and reports we're turning out here. So, General Fraser, the podium is yours. Please welcome General Douglas Fraser.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I will say a couple of things and appreciate the great work that the Center is doing, especially your publications on Central America. Thank you. Dr. Arnson. They really are important. They really do help us understand the situation and gain insights that we wouldn't get other ways. So it really is a pleasure for me to be here today, have an opportunity to talk with you about a topic that, from a military standpoint, is not something, as I grew up in my military career, it was a topic that I thought I was going to be focused on. But as I look around the region, thank you, as I look around the region and I look at Latin America, I really look at the Western Hemisphere writ large. For Central, South America, the Caribbean, I don't see an external military threat. As I look within the region, there are some issues, some concerns between some of the countries, but again, I don't see an internal military conflict anytime in the near future either way. Governments, institutions have worked through diplomatic avenues and through international venues to address the issues that they are concerned about, and I see that trend continuing. So the security issue that I see throughout the region is transnational organized crime and the impact it is having on security throughout. And I'll talk a little bit more about this very specifically. I see it in my terms as a 21st century threat. And it's a 21st century threat, again, because in my terms, I see it in two different landscapes. I see it as, on a regional basis, as one that doesn't start and end in one country. It doesn't start and end in one sub-region. If I look at cocaine specifically, there is a source zone, which is the northern part of South America. There is a transit zone, and this is as we look at it from the United States. There's a transit zone that comes through Central America primarily right now, through the Caribbean to a lesser amount right now, but if you go back 20 years, it was much worse in the Caribbean. And then into the demand part of that, which is the United States. We have to address each part of that landscape. There's no way to address each one of it individually. And then as we look more broadly than that and look at some of the other influences on these criminal organizations, it is not just trafficking in cocaine. We focus on that a lot because that's what we know the most about. But in reality, it's a criminal organization. That criminal organization is looking to fund its activities in whichever manner it can. So we're seeing precursors and in growing numbers of precursors for methamphetamines flowing from other parts of the world into Central America and then up into the United States. But I think there's another landscape that we need to look at as we look at this problem also, and that is it is a network. It is a network of networks, and it doesn't, again, start and end in one location. To work that from the source zone through the transit zone to the demand zone, there are different organizations, different parts of networks that all enable and empower. So we need to understand those networks as well, and we need to start putting pressure on them. And again, I talk about this from a United States perspective, but if you go and take that same analogy and move it much more broadly, that source zone, that transit zone, that demand zone is going to other parts of the globe. It's not just constrained to the Western Hemisphere anymore. We're seeing increasing amounts, upwards of about 40% of the cocaine now is moving into West Africa and up into the demand zones of Europe and into the demand zones of the Middle East. So this is an issue that connects much more broadly than just in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. And from my standpoint, as I step back and look at it, we have a role to play from a U.S. military standpoint. We have a supporting role, and I see it as a limited and a supporting role in supporting U.S. government efforts and international efforts around the region and more broadly around the globe to play a part in that. And I'll explain our role specifically here as we go through the morning. And I'll be happy to answer your questions or discuss this after we end. So bottom line to it is right now, within my area of responsibility, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, and that's responsibility for U.S. forces in that engagement. I see the biggest concern right now in Central America. That's where violence is causing the biggest impact on the stability, security within the region. And some of that violence is caused by organized crime. Gang members cause part to it. There are some social issues that are also represented in that violence. So again, we can't just confine this to one key issue that it's all being caused by transnational organized crime. So we need to understand the relationships and the capacities there better. But it is an issue, and it is an area that we continue to focus on. Why do I see this as a 21st century problem that we weren't facing last century? And from that, I see it from a globalization standpoint. Globalization and all the capacities that have helped support business and commerce and grow our economies around the world have had a negative result in supporting the growth of illicit trafficking and kidnappings and facilitating their ability to move product around the world as well. As a result of that, it falls and it crosses some of the boundaries that I talked about before, and again, I'll explain that as I go through the morning. The impact it is having because of the resources that it can now garner, and our estimate is that the profit gained from a transnational organized criminal activity in Central America on an annual basis is $18 billion a year. That's profit. So you take that profit and you look at the gross domestic products of countries, you look at the capacities of governments to fund their security forces, and these organizations really outclass their ability to fund and support their activities. And that is having a destabilizing impact in the region, as we talked about, not only from the illicit trafficking, but the violence is concerned, but it's also the bribery, the coercion, the other impacts that it has for them to facilitate their activity. These organizations within Central America are very diversified. As I mentioned, they work in precursor chemicals, weapons, move back and forth throughout the region, from military-grade weapons to also commercial weapons. There's trafficking in persons. There's trafficking in bulk cash, and that moves back and forth throughout the region. It's not just a one-way street into the United States. A lot of that activity comes back out of the United States. And so it is having an impact there. If we talk cocaine specifically, 90% of the cocaine coming into the United States transits through Central America in whatever manner. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It is a very lucrative business. And these businesses also support all those activities. As I look at what they support and how they conduct their activity, these are very smart and capable organizations. And as we from an international community, as local organizations put pressure in one location, they look for a way to move to other places where there is less resistance. And they look for other capacities to build. Many of you are aware of semi-submersible vessels, as we call them, or fully submersible vessels that we have seen more recently. These semi-submersible vessels are built in the jungles, primarily of Colombia and Ecuador. 100 feet long, crew of 4 people, can travel from the coasts of South America to off the coast of Mexico, Guatemala, unrefueled, can carry up to 10 tons of cocaine. And if you look at that from an economic standpoint, our estimates are it costs $2 million to build one of these vessels. The market value for 10 metric tons of cocaine is roughly $250 million. So it's a pretty significant return as you look at it. And these vessels are very hard to detect. They have very low water lines. They're painted to be camouflaged in the water. And so they're very difficult to find. And we're seeing then an evolution into fully submersibles. These are vessels similar in make, wood, fiberglass, that can submerge when they detect that there is law enforcement activity or international activity around them that's trying to detect them, and stay there for some amount of time and then continue to transit. Sophisticated vessels that have periscope systems, that have exhaust and intake systems so that they can operate in a submerged basis. And these are all built, homemade built vessels again throughout the region. So that gives you some idea as you look at that capacity along with a lot of other different types of maritime activity as well as aviation activity of how they're transiting these goods through the maritime environments of the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific into Central America. And why are they using the maritime means as they transit? primarily because there is no road connecting Colombia with Panama. And so they worked to move around that obstacle, if you will, and then make land wherever it's most favorable throughout Central America. Today, that happens to be primarily Honduras. The eastern and northeastern part of Honduras is where we see both aviation and maritime activity principally. Panama is the second location where that activity comes ashore, and Guatemala is the third. And the reason they do that is then once they get on ground, they can distribute their loads, makes it much harder to detect, and they follow the road systems up through Mexico into to the southwest border and across the U.S. border into the United States. So a very difficult challenge. And those networks are supporting one another all the way along the path through Central America. And as we talked about, the violence has grown to pretty dramatic dimensions within Central America. Honduras today, 2011, has a homicide rate of 86 per 100,000. Guatemala has a homicide rate of 41 per 100,000, and in El Salvador it's 66 per 100,000. There are pockets that it's even worse. San Pedro Sula is the most violent city in the world now, and that's 159 per 100,000, city in Honduras. So pretty significant, and it's having an impact as you look at the lives of the people who live there. It permeates entire societies, if you will. For example, if you're a prosecutor and you're focused on a high profile to a case against drug traffickers, there's a high potential that you'll be dismembered and be left as a warning to governors and to local officials. Journalists, it's a very difficult place to be journalists who are now focused on addressing and writing on corruption and illicit trafficking. That's become, in many places, a death sentence as well. And it even impacts students who are walking back and forth to school. If they're at the wrong place at the wrong time, they could be the victims of just incidental violence. It is having a significant impact throughout the region. As a result, because of this deteriorating situation and because of the capacities of law enforcement, countries in the region, especially in the northern part, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, have asked their militaries to support their law enforcement capacities to address this situation. And as I talk with those militaries, they clearly understand their role. They understand that they have limited authority. Their job is to support law enforcement. But they focus on what the government have asked them to do in these situations. And so we see enormous challenges as we look across the region then in helping support. And so that's where I see our reality as we focus and approach this issue. It is the reality that militaries are being asked to come in and support this activity. So how do we help train? How do we help them work so that they can better integrate and coordinate with law enforcement activities? As you look in the international waterways and airspace, the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, that has been a traditional role for the United States military to support activities. Joint Interagency Task Force South celebrated its 23rd anniversary this last year. An interagency group, law enforcement, military, intelligence organizations, plus representatives from partner nations, all working together to address this common problem. So I see us as part of the solution. I don't see us as the solution. And I see us a part of the solution in working our capacities and working within our authorities to support law enforcement and other government agencies to address the overall problems that we see throughout the region. And I see it as we work to help coordinate those activities country by country. Our mechanisms from a 20th century standpoint all have very defined lanes, and that's all good. But we've learned how to work within those lanes, and a lot of those times when we work country by country, we'll work bilaterally. But this is a regional problem. It's not just a bilateral problem. So how do we coordinate the activities of one country with another country with another country so that we make sure we're adding this whole way along the line and we look at it from a regional problem? That's where I see that we have a role to play in supporting the State Department and other agencies of the U.S. government to address this problem. And I see the entire interagency approach growing very, very deliberately throughout the region. And from my perspective, my goal, I'll put it very specifically from a U.S. Southern Command standpoint, is to support this engagement, if you will, and support our interagency and our partner militaries to the point that this is not a regional security problem, but it becomes a problem that local police and law enforcement capacities can handle. And right now, that is not the situation that I see within the region. So let me give you just a couple of ideas of how we support the Central American Region Security Initiative pillars, goals, because we are integrated very directly into the State Department's goals as we look through Central America. But before I do that, let me just also say that as I see our engagement, and I'm talking the United States engagement throughout the region, it is a coordination of more than one program. So the program with Merida in Mexico connects with the Central American Region Security Initiative, which connects with the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which also connects with the support to the U.S. government to Colombia. And we're also engaged very much with Peru in a very similar manner now to help support their fight against Sendero Luminoso. All these different different strategies are all connected, and I think we need to look at them as connected whole and not as just individual programs. And we are working to support each one of those, with the exception of Merida, because that's a U.S. Northern Command responsibility to work with the Mexican military in that capacity. So as I look down through the CARC pillars, the CARC Pillar 2 is to disrupt the movement of criminals and contraband. And here's where we work very directly in the maritime and air environments to direct the detection and monitoring of illicit trafficking as it flows through those regions. But I want to make sure we understand that this is a connected whole. All we're doing is one part of this link of that traffic as it moves through the region. As it departs South America, that information normally comes from law enforcement, intelligence and law enforcement information. That is passed to Joint Interagency Task Force South, which now directs aircraft or ships to monitor that traffic as it transits through the maritime environment. And once it gets to a location where there is a ship or a capability that can intercept it, that vessel intercepts, but that vessel has law enforcement capacity on board. And so the law enforcement will then detain and move those individuals to prosecution, whether it be in a host nation or to other parts, to the United States. So it is a truly interagency operation, everybody working within their own authorities, within their own capacities, towards a common goal to focus and support that effort. That has been our focus for up to over 20 years now. We've recently changed a strategy in our approach in the maritime environment. We call it Operation Martillo. It focuses on a little more, on a more persistent focus on the traffic as it's moving back and forth throughout the region, using the same capacities, same authorities that we have always used, just changing the approach that we're using to see if we can reduce the impact of these organizations and the movement through the Caribbean. We can force them to move other places that makes their trafficking and their movement of their capacities in a more difficult area. And that's primarily where we're working as we support the CARC Pillar 2. The CARC Pillar 3 is strong and capable governments, and the goal really of safe streets. Our programs really look to foster professional militaries, civilian-led militaries, foster respect for human rights, the rule of law, and help support their engagement in the region. We're also looking to see how we can be creative within this area as well. And where does it make sense to have U.S. military police go down and help support that engagement back and forth of how armed forces support law enforcement as they work back and forth within each of these areas. We also conduct exercises and training with these militaries to help build their capacity. Very traditional military-to-military engagement that still continues today. In addition to that, the next CARSI pillar is Pillar 4, the effective state presence. And we see that very much working with USAID, with other parts of the U.S. government, with coordinating where we can and support humanitarian assistance projects, where we support really building disaster response capabilities. How do we coordinate and continue to support USAID efforts and other government efforts to build those capacities where they need to be built, because that's where the biggest problem is in here. So it really is working with each part of the U.S. government, coordinating our efforts so that we're making the most of what we have. And then finally, Pillar 5 is enhanced cooperation. And we do that on a routine basis through military-to-military exchanges, through international military education and training programs, which help train militaries, help and educate militaries on their roles in society, and help build the relationships between one another. And then the exercises that we routinely conduct throughout the region also, that are, again, very traditional defense-related exercises that help build those relationships as well. We find that interaction and that engagement is critical to our role in sustaining our partnerships within the region and building and growing capacity throughout the region. So let me conclude by saying, I think as Vice President Biden demonstrated as he visited the region, that this really is, from a United States standpoint, a whole of government effort. But I see it as a whole of government, or whole of international effort. So we look at a group of friends that is supporting this effort internationally. We see growing support from nations within Latin America. Colombia is an example of bringing their experience, bringing their understanding to help support the countries in Central America to address this key issue as well. So I see growing strength and growing connection within the U.S. interagency and within the international community in building the capacity to support the governments in Central America to address this critical problem. I just want to leave you with that thought that I started out with, though. It is a regional and it is a hemispheric problem. And there is no one solution from one organization that will solve this problem. It is one that we have to work together, whole of governments, on an international basis, and I will take it one step further to a whole of societies also, because it is the societies that ultimately will benefit from this, and everyone needs to be involved to reduce the impact of this criminal activity. And we will play our role in supporting U.S. government efforts and international efforts to address this problem until we can help move it to a place where governments working with one another really have the capacity and the capability to address this on their own, and can coordinate that on a regional as well as international basis. I think we have a road to go on that, but that's the way I see our goals writ large from a government standpoint. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions.
Great. General Fraser, thank you very much for those remarks. And while you're getting mic'd here for the question and answer period, I'd like to throw out perhaps a first question. I just returned from Guatemala, where obviously President Otto Pérez Molina has made headlines by calling for forms of decriminalization. And I think as we speak, the presidents of Central America are meeting in Antigua to discuss proposals to bring to the Summit of the Americas for alternative, drug policies. I'm struck by, and I think we all of us who follow this phenomenon know that, for a long time the drug problem or cocaine production was centered in Colombia and Peru, and now we see the displacement of that. So is there, if you're successful in stopping some of the trafficking through Mexico and Central America, where do you think this will go next? And is there more that should be done within the United States on the demand side, ceasing weapons flows, improving money laundering? And are there alternative strategies that might be worth considering, given the tendency that we've seen over a period of decades, really, of the production and the trafficking, moving from one place to another? I know that that's a pretty broad question on the table, but I think some of the, those of us who follow this issue closely, have those kinds of questions in the back of our minds. I'd like to sort of leave that on the table and have you, perhaps touch on it in various ways and invite the participation of members of the audience. I'd ask you to please wait for the microphone and also identify yourself by name and by institution. Let's start with this gentleman here. If it's okay, we'll take maybe 3 questions. Okay. So we'll start with this gentleman. Yes, Veronica, right here.
Thank you, General Fraser. My name is David Nelson. I'm with GE now. My question is, actually I have 2 closely related questions. One is, does the definition of one of these trafficking groups as a criminal group or a terrorist group affect the doctrine of how Southcom or other military, U.S. military engages with them? And second, your emphasis on the whole of government approach to dealing with the issue is important, but one can foresee a situation where the budgets of most U.S. agencies decline relative to the Pentagon budget. You're faced with the dilemma of stepping up to fill in the gaps that are left behind as other agencies are forced by budget reasons to cut back, or cut back with them, leaving a hole for the traffickers. How do you address that? Thank you.
To your first question, it does differ on how we approach, whether we see it as a criminal organization or a terrorist organization. And I think Colombia provides the best example, where we see the FARC, which really crossed those lines. And so our approach changes a little in that realm, but it still requires a whole of government approach, because the military is not going to solve the problem by itself. No part of our government is going to solve it by itself. We have to work all those different avenues. As I look at the whole of government, I would argue that as our budgets get pressed, that puts more emphasis on the need to improve our coordination. Because more limited budgets mean that we still have the same problem, and we have to address it in a more focused manner, if you will, and it still takes each part of our government to address it. Again, the issues that I see, one of the reasons I think militaries are being asked to support law enforcement is, for most of the region, they're the highly regarded institution within those governments, and the populace and the government has more confidence in them than they do in other agencies. The real solution then becomes building the other capacities within governments so that the military isn't that organization that comes in and plays that role. And that's why I say it is not going to be our solution to this. We can help support those activities, but the real solution is in building the other capacities within government and the rest of society, so that there isn't the opportunity for criminal organizations to have the same impact that they are today.
Okay, this gentleman here on the side, right behind you. Yeah.
Buenos días, General. My name is Alex Sanchez. I work for the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. My question is, I guess, pretty straightforward. What do you think about the future role of the U.S. bases already in Central America? Joint Task Force Bravo in Honduras and the Air Force Base in El Salvador. Do you foresee, for example, flying out UAVs out of El Salvador to look for narco airfields, or do you foresee that you will expand the presence there to look for airfields and other kind of drug trafficking organizations? Thank you.
I think that those locations have remained critical to the support to address the problem. And the issues, you look at aircraft that are patrolling, they only have so much fuel on the aircraft. And so the closer you can get to the location where they need to patrol and operate from that location means you have more time to spend looking for that traffic. The more transit time you have, the less time you have there. And that's why the value of these locations has been important to that overall international effort to counter the traffic through the maritime environment. And I find within Joint Task Force Bravo in Honduras, it provides support there, but it also provides the ability to support parts of our government as well as other governments in addressing directly the trafficking through those regions. We are not involved in any operations. We just provide support. And it also helps respond to disasters and provide humanitarian assistance where required. And it really provides a pretty immediate capacity to do that, where it would take us longer without that location there. So I see those locations remaining important. Where and how that changes, we will work with the governments in the region to see where the demand is and where the opportunities are. We'll look to see as forces become available from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, whether there's a better application and more application for those capabilities. But we need more surveillance and reconnaissance capacity, and we see more of that coming hopefully in the future, just because of the availability of forces.
I'm going to take this young woman here in the blue.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Uriarte. I represent Florida International University in Miami, Florida. We have quite a few relationships with Southcom, USAID, and many other departments here in the government. And I was wondering where you saw the future of academic institutions such as ours playing a role in your objectives and the government's objectives in Central America and around the world.
I see a great relationship. We have today, as you mentioned, a very close relationship with FIU. We have a close relationship with the University of Miami and other academic institutions. And your ability to go out, study programs, help educate one another on the capabilities and requirements there, help us see the solutions maybe in a different way than we would be looking at it otherwise, are going to be important. And finding those solutions, I would argue, as we look even more broadly, and I'll give you homework since you're at FIU and supporting FIU, it's how do we look at this in what I would say is a non-traditional manner? How do we approach addressing the problem in a manner differently than we have traditionally approached the problems? And I'll go back and address Colombia for that example. We focused a lot from a U.S. government standpoint in supporting Colombia. Colombia really is the success story because of their focus and their efforts to do it. We just provided support where it provided a good leverage opportunity. But as a result, as you see, trafficking organizations are moving other places. So we have to keep pressure on all parts of the organizations, not just on one part. And our systems are built to work bilaterally, less to work regionally, and less to work across agencies. So you all can help us determine solutions and find ways to address this problem differently than we have in the past.
This gentleman here in the middle.
My good friend.
Thank you, General. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Guillermo Herrera from the U.S. Naval War College. With the reductions in your budget, and you mentioned coordination, how do you see the participation of the countries in the region to help each other? And do you see it feasible? Problems? What problems are there? How do you see that it could be solved?
This is a very difficult issue as we work through. And let me just use the U.S. government as an example. And I'll use the U.S. military as an even more defined example. We have been working on being more joint and operating more joint for almost 30 years now. We're still evolving how we work jointly. We're evolving today the interagency coordination, and we have varying degrees of cooperation as we look within the U.S. government of how we work on an interagency basis. As you go to embassies and country teams, they normally work pretty well together. But as you then expand that on a regional basis, the interagency doesn't coordinate as well as it could there. Now, as you start bringing in each government and each agency within a government, it gets to be a very complex problem. But that's the problem we have to address, and that's the problem we have to solve. And I see that there is opportunity and there are solutions there if we all focus on that single problem, which is citizen security. And citizen security is all in the interest of us all. And each part of our governments and each part of our interagency partners as well as international partners have a role to play. But we can only do that working together. And so I go back to our educational institutions standpoint. We need solutions and we need new ways of thinking about how to approach this. And we need that from us as well as those other institutions. And the last thing I'll say, going back again to the FIU question, is that we've started a private-public relationship. How do we work better with the private sector? We talk a lot about governments here, but we cannot forget the private sector. In the private sector, non-governmental organizations, we're all part of the solution. So we all have to see ourselves as part of the solution, and we all have to work to that end.
General Fraser, if I could just jump in with another comment to pick up on some of the things you've been saying about the budgetary limitations. I think that's been reflected in a number of the comments. I think all of us who work on foreign policy face the constant challenge of making these issues of interest and relevance to the U.S. public. And I'm really struck by the figure that you cited in your presentation of the $18 billion value of 10 tons of cocaine of one shipment. And then I sort of balance that against the amount that we've been spending over basically the last 3 or 4 years, and all of CARSI comes to about $450 million. We obviously face budgetary constraints in this country. Do you see the American public and the Congress in particular in growing to understand the magnitude of this problem and being prepared to perhaps do more to support the variety of efforts that you've talked about?
I think it's a complex problem, and it fits within a mosaic on a global basis that there are other issues that our government and our nation is looking at. So we put it in that context, and we keep working within that context. And so I'm comfortable with where we are and how we're approaching it. But the real issue and real capacity for me is how do we connect those capacities that we have better to make a difference in that manner. And then we need to continue the efforts that we already do. I don't talk about what's happening in the United States a lot because that's not where my focus is. But the government, U.S. government, is investing over $10 billion a year looking to reduce demand, looking to educate, looking to help support counter-drug activities within the United States. But the one thing we don't talk about in the United States is drugs directly are related to the deaths of over 37,000 Americans a year. That's more than we kill on the highways. But that doesn't get resonate. There are criminal organizations who have networks, are part of these networks in U.S. cities. There are problems within the United States also. We're not divorced from the problem. So both domestically as well as throughout the hemisphere, we need to help support all parts of it and do our part within the United States as well.
Thank you. Here in the middle, in the back, yeah, right here. I'm not sure the mic is on.
Ian Ramsey North, Partners for Democratic Change. I was wondering if you've set concrete metrics for success for Southern Command in this. You've discussed citizen security a lot. Does that mean that you're looking particularly at homicide rates, increasing sort of indicators within that area? Would you consider an increase in the price of cocaine on the streets of the U.S. to be a successful indicator? What are you using to measure progress in this?
We have traditionally looked at the National Drug Policies number, which is to get to disrupt 40% of the cocaine flow that comes into the United States as that goal. And there has been a steady goal up to 2015 to address that issue. That has been a traditional because our focus has been in that detection and monitoring area. If you look at the price of cocaine, it's gone up 50% over the last 5 years. The quality has come down, so those are indicators. Actually, the use of cocaine has been going down in the United States over the last 3 to 5 years, but the use of other types of drugs is going up. So there's still a demand issue here, and we can't just focus on cocaine. So that's what I'd say there. But beyond that, and this is from an interagency standpoint as well, we're really in discussions right now of what are the right metrics. How do we look at this as we cross interagency boundaries, and how do we focus our efforts to improve the way we have been supporting and working. So I don't have the answers exactly. If you got ideas, I'm open to whatever there are good metrics that would help us measure that better.
Sure, right here.
Yes, Luis Cardona.
One second, we'll just...
Luis Cardona with the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services. About 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of being a part of an initiative that I believe led by Secretary Gates called Unconventional Warfare, where it had in place, it was like this war game scenario, right, where we were focusing on Central America, and it talked about the level of coordination that you've been talking about, General Fraser, in terms of how to address not just the trafficking, but a wide array of citizen security issues. And coming from the more grassroots perspective and experience myself, and now being in government, I was really impressed with the process. So my question to you is, well, two questions. The first question is, how do you see something like unconventional warfare being used as a strategy to bring about the level of coordination and everyone getting on the same page? Because it's my belief that I think that there's some serious potential there. The second piece is, if that strategy continues to stay as such, is there a possibility that we could then try to make efforts to involve some of those other countries in an exercise like that? That was the first thing that came to mind as I sat through those 10 days out here in Potomac, Maryland. I was like, if we could just have a wide array of people from those countries involved in this process, I think we could do some incredible work.
There's already a lot of support and a lot of initiatives going down. I won't call it an unconventional warfare approach, but the State Department has a group that is working very deliberately on how we work this interagency effort and focus those efforts to build that strategy. It supports CARSI, but it is how do we help put a little more finality, details to how we approach that effort. We look at the countries within the region. SICA is focused on this effort as well. Other countries within Latin America, as well as international, with the Western Hemisphere international community, are also bringing their capacities. And I see a lot of different efforts that are focused here. There's efforts within the United States government as well as SICA to coordinate those efforts. So this is a work in progress, and it is improving. Maybe not as fast as I would like it to see improve, but it is improving, and we are moving and taking very positive steps forward, and that needs to just continue to be our focus. And I get a sense from everyone I talk with that that is a key focus, and we will remain engaged in that manner.
This gentleman here on with the mustache.
Yes, I'm Ramon Daubon with the Esquel Group here in Washington, D.C. You mentioned in passing the Caribbean. Would you care to comment about the role of Puerto Rico, which is rapidly increasing entry and transshipment points, and where drug-related violence is approaching Central American levels in the middle of an economic crisis, which is beginning to look like a collapse?
Well, the trafficking organizations are looking for any opportunity they have and looking for those areas. Today, on an overall basis, the traffic through the Caribbean is much less than it is in Central America. We continue to monitor that. It has a differing impact as you look at Central America, but the same kinds of programs as we look at the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, and that's where I'm focused. But other parts of our government are helping address and support the issue within Puerto Rico. So that's just, again, as we look at the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, CARSI, all these different elements, the United States and territories of the United States are all part of that solution. So I don't have specific answers to you right now other than it remains, as I work with U.S. Northern Command and work with other agencies within the U.S. government, a very clear focus that it's not just Central America, it is a regional look.
All the way in the back over there.
Hi, my name is Tara McKelvey, and I'm a public policy scholar, and I'm also a journalist. I write for Newsweek and the Daily Beast. Can you tell us about the submarines, the ones you described? Like, how many are there? Are there more? And also, how do they build them in the jungle?
A lot of those questions I can't answer.
At least not an open session.
Well, they are built in the jungles. Like I said, they pull them, or they have construction sites in estuaries in triple canopy jungle along the coast of Colombia and South America. Very hard to find, very hard to discover. And they take commercially available products and they construct a vessel. Again, the dimensions, 100 feet long, crew of 4 to 6, some pretty sophisticated vessels. The Peruvian or the Ecuadorians captured one over a year and a half ago that had both diesel motors and electric motors. It had batteries. It had a video system so that they could look outside and see whether or not there was an approach from another vessel. It had a navigation system. And so it had not gotten underway. And so that was an opportunity to understand this capacity. I can't tell you how many there are. I just don't have that information. And it's a difficult vessel to detect. And so we're working on both where they're building them, see where the opportunities to detect them in the transit area, where and how they work, and offload their cargo to figure out where is the best way to continue to address those problems. We have seen a growth, though. That's the fully submersible. They take a little longer to build, maybe a year or longer than that, and cost a little bit more money, but the return is the same as we talked before. This is the first year also we've seen semi-submersibles built a very similar vessel, just stays on the surface. We've seen them for the first time in the Caribbean. So we're seeing expanded use of these types of vessels for the transport of not only drugs, but we've captured some cases bulk cash moving back south. So it is a transportation vessel.
Fraser, I'd like to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the role of the military. And as we know, the armed forces, as you pointed out, is one of the institutions that has the greatest level of respect, among citizens in the countries of Central America. And at the same time, there's a lot of controversy about whether or not the military should be involved in this kind of struggle, precisely because of the efforts during, the peace accords era and the implementation to get the armed forces out of an internal security role. So I guess, given that that sort of contradiction or conflict, what role should the U.S. government play? Is there a role for Southcom in reinforcing the law enforcement capabilities in Central America? And how are you working, or how is Southcom working, to bolster to that element of the government response?
We work very deliberately with our partner militaries. Again, focused on respect for human rights, rule of law, their role within government organizations and civilian governments, And what I see very deliberately and very consciously from the militaries that I work with is a very keen respect for their role and where they should be conducting operations and not. And the governments decide on a case-by-case basis how they choose to bring the military into that focus. We have a very limited role in helping support some law enforcement capacity, and that really is helping build facilities that help them operate, but the real training and capacity of that is Department of State and other parts of our government. So our efforts are to coordinate with them. And as I see most of the militaries, again, it varies country by country, but in a lot of cases, they're providing security for law enforcement. So they're not arresting people, and again, it varies country by country, but they're providing security where those law enforcement organizations might not have it otherwise. So they're looking for those solutions that respect their role in society, but understand that they have and the governments are asking them to play a role in this citizen security problem.
Okay. Blue shirt.
Good morning. I'm Jill Wheeler from the Inter-American Foundation, and I was intrigued by your comments about engaging whole societies and the public-private sector engagement. I wondered if you could just describe a little further what form that is taking, or are there certain countries or activities in which you have seen the most progress or see the most potential for success?
A lot of that public-private, and we're just now expanding to see where the other opportunities are, and it really, it's just an opportunity where we can connect some engagement where we might not otherwise. For example, if we go in and build a school, we don't have the authority to equip it. We don't have the authority to pay for teachers or to provide teachers or other capacity. So we'll look to see if we can find a private organization who can provide that capacity. We're just linking up opportunities so that overall, again, we respect our authorities, and I'm not trying to change that. We're just looking, as we cross all these problems, that there are solutions. We just have to look in a different manner. And a lot of this also then goes back to disaster response. Haiti is my best example of that. As we responded to Haiti, there were lots of private organizations who were looking to assist. In some cases, there were organizations that had products that they needed moved. And there are other airlines, cargo companies who could move. But they didn't understand how to connect to the opportunities. So we just provided a connective tissue to help them do that. Working with USAID, but trying to help support those opportunities. So as we look to the future, that's what I see as you work with AID projects, as you work with a lot of different programs. How can private industry support government activities, and not just U.S., but host government activities as well? It's an area, I think, where there's a lot of growth opportunity.
If I could just do the 30-second advertisement, the Central America Business School in Cary is involved in just that kind of project to engage the private sector in citizen security issues, and there will be a conference on April 19th at the World Bank with Cary, World Bank, State Department, and the Wilson Center is also playing a role. So I think across the board, a lot of people see this as a really vital part of the solution, coming from countries themselves. I think we have time for two more questions.
Can I just add in one?
Sure, please.
There also.
Please.
It is when the societies decide that it is their problem to fix that we'll find the solution. And that's the real crux of this. And that's why I think, from my standpoint, it's important to enlist and help them understand how they can connect with various government activities to provide part of the solution. And that's why we're looking at where those opportunities are to support our activities, and as we support other government activities to build those relationships and those opportunities.
Thank you, General Fraser. My name is Sonia Schott with Global Vision Venezuela. You mentioned there are some concerns in the region. I would like to know if Venezuela is one of them. What specific are these concerns? And you mentioned recently some issue involving drones, Iran and Venezuela. I was wondering if you can make some comments on that and cooperation in general between both countries. Thank you.
Should we take the last one or two?
Sure.
Okay, we'll take right here. Or you want to call on somebody? Go ahead.
No, she asked the question.
Right. No, do you want to take a couple of questions and then come back for one final answer, or do you want to go one-on-one?
Well,
however you prefer. However you prefer.
Let me just answer
Absolutely.
the question. On a military-to-military basis, we have very small relations with Venezuela today. And that has been more their intent than our intent, but there's just no cooperation that we see back and forth between Venezuela and the United States. We face common problems. The issue we're talking about is a common problem. And from my perspective, Venezuela has not stepped up within the U.S., within the international community, to support these efforts to the level at which they could. And I think there's an opportunity for them to help support and address this problem. Because as I mentioned, it's a supply side to a transit to a demand side, and all parts of this effort need to be addressed. The coordination that they have between Colombia and Venezuela has improved over the last couple of years. I think that is a very helpful indication, and I just would like to see that cooperation grow as we face this common problem.
Thank you. My name is Alexander Kravitz. I'm a former Salvadoran government official. I wanted to go back to the question on the intervention of the military being called out to help with law enforcement. What are some of the metrics to determine whether that has been a successful, whether that's a successful effort? What would be some of the metrics that policymakers should be looking at to determine, was this a good decision? Are we making progress or not progress? Because one can get the impression that it could almost be more of a, I don't want to call it a publicity measure. You know, it's visible. It's you know, the soldiers are out on the street. But what does it specifically? How does it specifically add value in terms of solving the problem?
Again, each country has to decide what that is. And with the standpoint of El Salvador, they have asked, and now more than half of the military is engaged in supporting law enforcement activities. And they're supporting the operations of prisons, as you know, as well as supporting law enforcement. And what I see is it is the security. Homicide rates is one measure. I think we need to look at some other definitive measures also. But that's not, again, the only measure. And I think the best understanding of that is as we put pressure on some of these organizations, they will become more violent rather than less. And I guess the other impact that I would see is I understand that some of these organizations are starting to focus on attacking the police and the military because of the impact that they are having on their operations. So in my mind, that's not a very good measure. It's not a positive one, but it shows the impact of their security and more folks on the streets. Now again, that's not from a law enforcement standpoint, it's from a security standpoint and the cooperation that goes back and forth to help them out. That's an area I think we need to do more work in. Figure out what are the exact metrics that help us understand where the positive factors are and where they're not. And going back to Colombia, I think there's an opportunity to understand that from Colombia's perspective, and that's just a perspective because they've been working this issue. We need to understand that in each of the countries as we go forward and see how we can move those metrics out. So I don't have a specific answer for you yet. Again, we're working our way through to understand how best to measure that impact as we support governments and as they address this on their own terms.
Okay. Do we have time for one more
One more.
question? One more question. Let's go all the way to the back.
To go back to the original question you posed,
Excuse
and
me, if
also
you could just identify yourself as well.
Larry Heilman from the Anthropology Department in the Smithsonian. To go back to the original question that you posed and the platforms that you're using to address the issue, I'd like to add to that equation Bolivia. I'm surprised that Bolivia wasn't even mentioned as being a problem, but maybe that's because of the fact that we have Morales as the president. But are there things that you can do to protect this enormous development investment that we've made in Bolivia for 60 years? It seems to have had some real progress in that area, but also some real advances in the whole area of alternative development, agricultural production. I'm just curious to see if this is still on the radar scope and if there's anything that's going to be done in this area in terms of joint efforts between the military, the State Department, AID, et cetera.
It is still part of our focus. We're engaged with all our partners throughout the region from a military to military standpoint. Our military to military engagement with Bolivia has been reduced over the last few years. Their desire, not our desire. And from a drug enforcement agency standpoint, that has been very much reduced as well. But we are, and there is a trilateral agreement that has been formed between Brazil, Bolivia, and the United States to help address this transnational organized crime issue across the borders, Brazil, Bolivia. And so the United States is playing a role in that effort. Again, not us directly. That really is other agencies of the United States government to work. So there's still a very deliberate engagement with Bolivia, and we're looking for the opportunities to continue to work together with them. Again, we all face a very similar problem, and it is only in working this together that we're going to be able to really address it. And I talked a lot about Central America and the impact there, one, because that's where I see the biggest violence issue and the biggest impact on security. And from a U.S. perspective, that's the area that affects us most directly from a defense standpoint. That said, we're very engaged with all the other partners on a mutual relationship and a mutual partnership. And I see that very much continuing into the future.
General Fraser, would you like to make a final comment, one last thought that you'd like to leave us with?
I'll begin or end with how I started, and that is there is no one solution to this problem. We all have to decide that it is our problem, and we're going to be a part of the solution. And every one of us has a role, whether it's here domestically or whether it's supporting activities in governments internationally. So I would ask for your ideas, your thoughts, your engagement on how we can address this issue writ large, because it is an area and it is an issue that is going to continue to impact us. And I'd ask us not to focus just on drugs either, because it is criminal activity. And my example of that is I was in Colombia about 3-4 weeks ago. The problem, because of gold prices, the problem of illegal gold mining is growing. The problem of illegal mining is growing other places to support criminal activity. These same organizations are engaged in this same type of efforts. So we need to look at it from what it is and what roles we play to address that problem overall. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.